High above the Canadian wilderness, the pilots of an Air Canada Boeing 767 are engaged in a last-ditch struggle for survival. They are running out of time because their enormous jet has run out of fuel. In the upcoming minutes, will they and their 61 passengers meet their demise, or will they be able to return to safety? This is Air Canada Flight 143's amazing tale. 8 crew members and 61 passengers boarded an Air Canada Boeing 767 in Montreal in the afternoon of July 23, 1983. With a quick detour in Ottawa, they were headed all the way to Edmonton in the west of the nation. They were all going to be involved in one of the most notorious incidents in aviation history, but no one knew it yet. Most people are unaware that the narrative of Flight 143 consists of a series of improbable and very regrettable circumstances, yet many descriptions of this episode concentrate on a single error. This series of mishaps would expose serious weaknesses in Canada's aviation sector, with global repercussions. That June day, Air Canada's brand new Boeing 767 and 61 passengers were being transported to Edmonton by Captain Robert Pearson, who had landed at Montreal Airport. With slightly over 15,000 hours of flight time, he was a very experienced pilot at the age of 48. In addition to flying a broad range of aircraft for Air Canada, he enjoyed flying gliders in his own time. He was to have no knowledge of this when he drove up at the airport for what seemed to be a perfectly normal trip, but in many ways, his whole life had been a preparation for the events of this day. The pilots who had just flown the jet into Montreal were heading home from the airport when Pearson arrived in the airport parking lot that day. As the pilot greeted them, the departing crew reported that, with the exception of a minor problem, the new aircraft was in excellent operating condition. The gasoline gauges were having issues. This issue necessitated the manual use of a drip test to determine the amount of gasoline in the aircraft's tanks. This entails removing a stick that shows the fuel depth in centimeters from the underside of each tank. Although it may seem simple, it was a rather accurate method of determining how much gasoline was on board. On this day, First Officer Morris Kintel, age 36, joined Captain Pearson. Kintel had over 7,000 hours of cumulative flying time, making him quite experienced as well. He was a member of the Canadian Air Force prior to joining Air Canada. For reasons you wouldn't anticipate, this Air Force expertise would prove to be crucial to this journey. They were traveling aboard a brand new Boeing 767. At the time, the 767 was Boeing's newest aircraft, having just been in service for less than a year. It was a technical miracle, replacing many of the circular dials present in previous airplanes with tiny television displays. Crucially, the role of flight engineer was automated, making it the first Boeing wide-body aircraft with just 2 flight crew members. Because of the events that would transpire on this day, this seeming progress would come under intense examination. The upper panel of the Boeing 767 houses the fuel quantity gauges. They can determine how much petrol is on board thanks to sensors in the fuel tanks. The gauges receive this data from 2 channels, Channel 1 and Channel 2, providing redundancy. The second channel may show the fuel amount on its own in the event that the first one fails. To ensure that the data from the remaining channel are correct, the plane's fuel must also be manually verified if just one channel is operational, as it did on this particular aircraft. A ground engineer had been in the cockpit repairing the malfunctioning instruments while the pilots had been conversing in the parking lot. At the plane's last stopover, the previous engineer discovered that the display was blank. To fix this, he pulled the Channel 2 circuit breaker. This indicated that the gauge was only receiving data from Channel 1, and it began to function. Now, this ground engineer in Montreal wanted to reset the system to see if that would help it function. The screens went dark as he inserted the circuit breaker for Channel 2. After that, he conducted some further research before noting the problem in the aircraft's technical record. He was then summoned out to do the fuel drip test just before he had a chance to turn on the fuel gauges by pulling the circuit breaker for Channel 2. The fuel gauges didn't change. This was the beginning in a very regrettable series of errors that would soon put everyone's life in jeopardy. At the same time, Captain Pearson had reached the plane and started preparing the cockpit for the trip to Ottawa. He discovered that the gasoline gauges were blank while he was doing this. However, considering that he had just spoken with the departing crew, this made sense. He anticipated that there might be an issue with the gasoline gauges. Importantly, however, the incoming crew had not encountered this issue. For them, the gasoline gauges had been operating flawlessly. The gauges were now blank, but only because the ground engineer had not completed troubleshooting them. However, the captain was unaware of this. This must be the issue the other pilots had been talking about, he thought. Pearson reasoned that Air Canada must have approved the aircraft despite the fact that it was prohibited to fly with blank fuel gauges. At the time, when planes could be sent out, this was standard procedure in the airline, even if they didn't fit the so-called minimum equipment list specifications. However, there was an additional factor that ought to have alerted the captain that the fuel meters should have been operational. It is the captain's responsibility to review the aircraft's technical log prior to each flight in order to determine what maintenance has been performed and if there are any unresolved concerns. Another terrible bit of bad luck occurred when the captain examined the tech log and saw that neither engineer's entry refuted his suspicion that the jet had been operating with blank fuel gauges. While the other tech log entry from the ground engineer in Montreal, read, found fuel quantity indicator blank, the first entry from when the plane was at its last stopover, read, fuel quantity indicator not working, suspect processor unit at fault, and he gives the part number before saying there's nothing left in stock. Although the engineer was able to locate the indicator's bank in the second entry, the captain was unaware of this. He now strongly believed that Air Canada must have approved of this as the aircraft had been operating without functional fuel gauges. Although alarming, none of these should have posed a serious risk to the flight safety. Ultimately, the skipper could tell how much gasoline was in his wings without the need of fuel meters. He may instruct the fuelers to enter the quantity he needs according to the flight plan, and they could use the drip test to verify that amount. However, here is when the strangeness begins. The ground engineers were behind the wings, monitoring the level of gasoline in the tanks, while the captain was up in the cockpit checking over the tech log. They would fill up the tanks with enough gasoline to get the jet to Edmonton, after first determining how much was already in them. Based on their conversion tables, they discovered that each wing had a fuel depth of around 60 centimeters, which equated to roughly 7,600 liters overall. Pearson, however, preferred not to have the numbers in liters. He required them in kilos. However, neither he nor the first officer understood how to convert letters into kilos. In addition, the pilots had never had to perform this translation in the first place, since Canada had only recently switched to the metric system. They were only acting in this manner due to malfunctioning gasoline amount indicators. Since fueling airplanes was the fueler's full-time job, the captain instructed him to complete the modification. He must be able to convert liters to kilos. This is when the next awful mistake occurred. According to the fueler, all Air Canada aircraft use pounds rather than kilograms. And until recently, when Air Canada bought its 767s, he would have been correct. Actually, the only aircraft in the fleet that utilized kilos were these ones. He thus provided the conversion factor, which is used to convert liters into pounds rather than kilograms when the captain asked for it. The pilots were now carrying less than half the gasoline required for the journey to Edmonton, since 1 kilogram is roughly equivalent to 2 pounds. Furthermore, they couldn't see their error since the fuel gauges were blank. The jet had just 10,000 kilos of the 22,000 kilograms required to reach Edmonton when the fueler completed filling the wing tanks. The pilots were about to launch themselves into the air, together with 67 passengers and crew, on a fateful journey to Edmonton, blissfully oblivious to their blunders. At Montreal, the plane pulled back from the gate after the passengers had boarded and the cargo had been loaded. Before proceeding on to Edmonton, the pilots would first make a quick 30-minute flight to Ottawa. When Captain Pearson pushed the 767's enormous engines to take off thrust at 10 minutes to 6 that night, the aircraft started to accelerate down the runway. It was a normal departure from Montreal. Neither the pilots nor the passengers had any clue. Passengers that there was a problem, but catastrophe was waiting in the plane's fuel tanks. The gasoline level decreased steadily with each passing minute. Flight 143 reached Ottawa shortly after departing Montreal. Some passengers disembarked as Captain Pearson taxied the aircraft to the gate, while others boarded the plane headed for Edmonton. The pilots wanted to double-check that they had enough fuel for the journey to Edmonton just to be absolutely certain. They were aware that flying without operational fuel amount indicators was prohibited by the minimum equipment list. The refuelers were instructed by Captain Pearson to do the drip check on both wings. Upon doing so, they discovered that the plane's wing tanks had 11,430 liters of fuel. Once again, using the fake conversion ratio they had used in Montreal, the captain and first officer increased this number by 1.78. They gained 2,400 kilograms as a result, more than plenty to go to Edmonton. In actuality, however, the 11,000 letters should have been multiplied by 0.8, giving them a genuine weight of just more than 9,000 kilograms, nearly half of what they need. However, all the figures checked out properly since the pilots had consistently used the incorrect conversion factor. The flight planning was finished, and the additional passengers were on board in a matter of minutes. There would be no more chance for the pilots to realize their error after this. The clock began to tick as they restarted the engines. With just half the necessary gasoline in its tanks and no operational fuel gauges, Flight 143 took off late that afternoon. It was all routine for the first hour or so. The pilots spoke about the new aircraft and its systems as the food service passed through the cabin of Flight 143 as it sailed high over the Canadian landscape. The flight crew had been joined in the cockpit by another Air Canada pilot who was traveling as a passenger. He flew the considerably older Boeing 727, which was introduced in the 1960s. He was eager to see how the airplane functioned since he thought the 767 was a significant advancement. At 41,000 feet, the plane was higher than the majority of passenger planes at the time. Fortunately, it was also higher than most of the weather, especially considering the storm clouds they saw on their way. The pilots, however, treated the storms with deference, oblivious to the fact that something far more serious was developing aboard the plane itself. A beeping sound in the cockpit and an odd alert on the engine indicating and crew alerting system, ECS, stopped the crew as they were completing their lunch. It alerted them to the low pressure operating of the fuel pump in the left wing tank. This was out of the ordinary. How could a fuel pump issue arise in a brand new aircraft? The pilots saw that the low pressure signal was also activated on the overhead panel. In an attempt to determine the source of the issue, First Officer Kintel started looking through the 767's pilot's manual. In the meanwhile, the captain assumed that the low pressure indicator was likely the consequence of a malfunction in the fuel pump itself. He turned off the gasoline pump as a result. Although they discussed the possibility, the pilots ruled out the possibility that they were running low on fuel. In addition to checking the gasoline at Ottawa, the Flight Management System, or FMC, the aircraft's onboard computer, showed that they had enough of fuel to go to Edmonton. Additionally, it said that since leaving Ottawa, they had checked the gasoline at every stop. However, the quality of the data that was supplied into the FMC determined how accurate its fuel forecasts were. Additionally, the pilots were unaware that the fuel amount information they had entered was terribly incorrect. The fuel numbers it displayed to them were derived from the fictitious numbers they had input when the flight began. Then another light banked on while the pilots were still attempting to identify the issue. The fuel pumps on the left wing were now displaying a low pressure warning. It was a warning sign. The pilots were aware that the failure of both gasoline pumps on their own was very improbable. Anything had to be the reason, and it couldn't be anything positive. The pilots made the decision to divert right away. They sought a quick diversion to Winnipeg, their closest large airport, by radioing air traffic control. Captain Pearson proceeded downhill and turned toward Winnipeg. The controller asked the pilots if they wanted fire and services to meet them on the runway while they troubleshooted the issue. The captain indicated that for the time, they wouldn't be required. He was unaware that even the emergency services would be unable to assist them in a short while. The remaining fuel pump pressure lights for the right-wing fuel tanks came on a few seconds later. All of the pumps were now displaying low pressure. It made the flight crew nauseous. Now the above panel center was illuminated like a Christmas tree. The captain called the chief flight attendant to the cockpit and advised him of the situation. However, while he was doing this, the unimaginable occurred. The left-hand engine ran out of gasoline and flamed out. As the autopilot disengaged and the engine rolled back, alarms went off. Now the situation for the team was dire. What had started off seeming like a modest technical issue was suddenly a full-blown emergency. The first officer drew out the checklist for a single-engine approach and landing. At Winnipeg, the captain informed the controller that he would actually require emergency services. At this stage, the team was still unsure of the problem. Whatever it was, one engine had been disabled because it was so serious. Could it get worse, though? When the right-hand engine died less than 2 minutes later, they had their answer. The captain said, K. Pilots were in disbelief. Their instrumentation had gone absolutely blank without engine power. With 67 passengers and crew, their cutting-edge aircraft had suddenly devolved into a massive glider. As the plane sailed inexorably toward the ground below, the reassuring sound of its two engines had given way to an unsettling stillness. The pilots were shocked, but they had to move quickly. They had to decide where to land the aircraft. They also didn't have much time, since they were now 28,000 feet above sea level and dropping. The engines on a plane like the 767 do more than merely propel the airplane forward. They also provided with electrical and hydraulic power. Now that the engines were stopped, the hydraulically boosted control surfaces on the wings and tail became tremendously heavy. Using just his own arm power, the pilot had to pull the control surfaces against a mass of air traveling at hundreds of kilometers per hour in order to manage the plane's fall. However, the 767 was keeping a secret. The ram air turbine appeared from underneath the plane in a matter of seconds. The aircraft's most vital systems are powered by a tiny fan that rotates in the wind and produces a little quantity of energy. This provided power to the pilot's most essential instruments, and significantly, it also restored some hydraulic power to the flying controls. The controls were still hefty, but at least they could now be moved a little more readily. Air traffic control was notified by Captain Pearson that the aircraft had lost both of its engines and that an emergency had been declared. The pilots believed they could put the damaged aircraft down in Winnipeg when the controller approved the plane to go there. First Officer Kintel started going through the manuals for procedures that dealt with the loss of both engines while Pearson started to glide the aircraft. To his dismay, however, there weren't any. Simply said, Boeing had never considered the possibility that a member of the flight crew might need to glide one of its 767s. Kintel and Pearson were now test pilots, but their lives weren't the only thing on the line. The choices they made in the next several minutes would determine the fate of the 67 passengers and crew behind them. Stretching the glide as far as possible was something the skipper was keen to do. In this manner, he would have more alternatives on where to land the aircraft. As a pilot, he was aware that in order to fly as far as possible, he had to glide the aircraft at its ideal speed, which was the pace that guaranteed the least amount of altitude loss each kilometer. But there was an issue. Boeing had not published this speed in any of the manuals, since a twin-engine failure simply wasn't a possibility they had considered of. Pearson merely had to make an educated estimate as to the ideal glide speed and hope for the best. He determined that in the 767 this speed would be roughly 220 knots, or 400 kilometers per hour. And without motors, the only way he could regulate the speed of the plane was by adjusting the pitch attitude of the aircraft. Push the nose down, and he would gain speed. Pull it back, and he would lose speed. Now, his whole focus shifted to keeping the plane's glide as long as possible at 220 knots. The pilots had a key question now that they were in the glide. Could they possibly reach Winnipeg? Pearson was exerting every effort to extend the glide, but would it be sufficient? Given their present height, Kintel had to calculate how far they could glide. The vertical speed indicator, or VSI, is a device in the cockpit that typically tells pilots how quickly they are falling. However, this device had ceased to function in the absence of engines. Kintel was thus forced to do the computations by hand. His calculations were crucial. For everyone on board, a mistake from him may spell the difference between life and death. The pilots fervently hoped that Winnipeg was within striking distance. As he informed the passengers of the plane's catastrophic position, the chief flight attendant back in the passenger cabin made an effort to remain composed. Some passengers were led to the seats next to the emergency doors by the other flight attendants, who also gave them instructions on how to open them. But they were fully aware that these instructions were unlikely to be required at all. The loss of both engines was probably a death sentence for all those aboard. However, the pilots were working diligently in the cockpit, doing all within their power to improve their chances. The first officer matched the altimeter readings, which indicated the plane's height, against the air traffic controller's reports of the plane's distance from Winnipeg to determine the rate of descent. To determine the plane's rate of descent, and thus its range, he performed this at regular intervals. He discovered something horrifying when he performed these computations. The jet had descended 5,000 feet in the last 10 kilometers. In other words, it was falling at a speed of over 2,500 feet per minute. It would reach the ground in less than 10 minutes at such pace of fall. It could not be denied. Winnipeg would not be their destination. Now they had lost their greatest chance. However, there was no time to think about this. At once, Captain Pearson started to maneuver the aircraft to the north, in the direction of his only alternative. Gimli, a closed military airbase next to Lake Winnipeg, was that alternative. Interestingly, the first officer had served in the Canadian Air Force and had been stationed there. As the team descended, his acquaintance with the region would be invaluable. But for the pilots, a horrifying surprise was in store. Since Kentel had been stationed there, Gimli had undergone significant alteration. Actually, one of the runways had been turned into a racetrack, and the airport was now open to the public. It was also family racing day today, Saturday. At Gimli, racers zoomed up and down the runway, while pilots aligned their enormous aircraft with it, with their loved ones cheering them on from the sidelines. As they grilled their meals in the evening sun, they were completely unaware that a huge passenger plane was suddenly silently flying directly at them. The pilots had no idea that the races even existed. They couldn't see them now because they were too far from the runway. Getting his flying brick of an airplane onto the runway was the captain's first priority. There wouldn't be any second chances without engines. This was his only chance to land the plane. But as the jet got closer to Gimli, some other issues started to surface, as if the engine landing wasn't difficult enough. Insufficient hydraulic power was available from the ram air turbine, the fan that had descended from the fuselage to give power to lower the plane's flaps. An integral component of every landing are flaps. They make it possible for the plane to fly more slowly without stalling. Pearson would need to fly the plane at a far faster speed without flaps to keep it from stalling and plummeting out of the sky. He would have to fly this approach at least 180 knots, or around 330 kilometers per hour, instead of the standard approach speed of 140 knots. The pilots then ran into their next issue. The three lights that indicated their successful deployment never came on when First Officer Kentel lowered the landing gear lever. The hydraulic force needed to drop the gear was just insufficient. The plane was getting close to the ground and would strike it in less than a minute. Even if the result of this was already dire, it would be worse if the impact pressures were borne mostly by the plane's body. Kentel was instructed to activate the emergency gravity gear extension switch by Pearson. The door gear pins were freed by this switch, enabling the gear to gradually expand under its own weight. Anxiously, the first officer waited for the indication lights to indicate that the equipment had fallen. The left and right main gears locked into position after a suspenseful wait. The nose gear, however, did not, which is concerning. Without a nose gear, the aircraft's nose would wind up scraping the ground after landing, rendering left and right steering almost impossible and severely taxing the aircraft's construction. The pilots were unsure whether the aircraft could handle the pressure because of how quickly the jet was approaching. The likelihood that it would shatter an impact and reduce the chances of survival for the crew and passengers was quite high. At this point in his career, Captain Pearson was handling an aircraft that was more crippled than any other he had ever managed. In addition to lacking engines, flaps, and nose gear, the ram air turbines reduced hydraulic pressure as he slowed the aircraft for landing, made it much more difficult to use the flying controls. Pearson's control column was becoming heavier and harder to maneuver just as he was getting close to the runway, when he needed the greatest control possible. However, a fresh issue surfaced as the enormous plane approached the runway. The pilots had made an approach that was excessively high because they were anxious to save altitude during the glide. They had to descend since they were now far above their destination. They would acquire too much speed and wind up falling off the end of the runway upon landing if they just dived in that direction. Pearson and Kentel had to find a means to drop altitude without increasing speeds too much. The pilots would normally be able to apply the speed brakes if they found themselves too high. The aircraft can descend without becoming too fast thanks to speed brakes, which are flaps that rise from the wings to slow it down. However, the speed brakes weren't functioning without hydraulic power. The pilots needed an alternative. To increase the distance between their aircraft and the runway, they contemplated doing a full 360-degree rotation. They were too low to do a full-time spin, but Pearson realized that they were too high to just dive for the runway. 360 degrees. They would crash into the earth before returning to the runway if they tried. The pilots seemed to have run out of choices. However, Captain Pearson had one more ploy in store. He had learned a forward slip method while working as a guider pilot. A sophisticated maneuver for rapidly losing altitude without increasing velocity is the forward slip. It entails pressing the rudder in the opposite direction to keep the aircraft on track while rolling the plane to one side to make it go downhill. This is called crossing the controls, and while gliders often utilize it, passenger planes just don't do it. However, Pearson had no option on this particular day. In a desperate attempt to drop the aircraft in time to the runway, he banked his Boeing 767 hard to the left and stomped on the right rudder, crossing the controls. The passengers were frightened by the gut-wrenching maneuver. The plane's left-hand passengers were staring directly down into the fields below. The wind against its side buffeted the airplane, causing it to shiver and moan. As the pilot yanked the aircraft down, Kintel clung to it. This forward slide was not only severe, but it also had a risky consequence. The ram air turbine started to spin more slowly and generate even less hydraulic power as the air was no longer striking it directly. Here, Pearson had truly placed himself in a difficult situation. His flying controls were less sensitive and heavier than ever before. Would he even manage to get his plane straight enough to land? Or would he send passengers and airplane components flying onto the asphalt when he crashed sideways onto the runway? As Pearson struggled with his plane, Kintel saw something that made his heart stop. There were crowds of people and automobiles on the runway just in front of him. Now hundreds of lives on the ground were at danger in addition to those aboard the aircraft. Kintel made the decision to keep what he was witnessing from the captain. Now they had nothing left to do. The only safe spot to land the jet was on the runway. Even that was questionable. Pearson had to focus entirely on piloting the plane. The skipper dragged the enormous airplane back to level in the last seconds. Pearson aggressively applied the brakes as the jets crashed onto the runway, and he now saw two scared lads riding bikes in front of him, attempting to outpace the rushing aircraft. The nose smashed down against the guardrail that ran down the center of the runway as the plane's main tires broke, generating a deafening tremor within the aircraft. The enormous aircraft skidded 3,000 feet down the runway before ultimately coming to a halt, but the intense friction between it and the guardrail caused a fire to start in the nose. No one was harmed. In order to assist with the passenger evacuation and put out the fire that had erupted under the nose, racers hurried to the aircraft. The captain was leaving the plane when more hurried in with fire extinguishers. Upon seeing their extinguishers, he stated, "Don't worry, we're out of gas." Kintel and Pearson had just accomplished the unthinkable. They had successfully landed a passenger aircraft after gliding at about 100 kilometers from cruising altitude without causing any injuries to any of the passengers. Until another Canadian crew ran into a similar predicament halfway across the Atlantic Ocean in August 2001. This was the longest glide in the history of commercial aviation. You may see my coverage of the occurrence in the upper right corner of your screen. Air Canada standardized the fuel weight units across its fleet as a consequence of the inquiry that followed this event. In order to avoid such misunderstandings, they also enhanced their fueling protocols and included circuit breaker inoperative tags, which would stop the breaker from being reset. Crucially, they also created a flight safety organization inside the airline whose responsibility was to identify weak points and adjust protocols appropriately. Despite being praised as a hero by the media, Air Canada reprimanded Captain Pearson for 6 months and punished the first officer for 2 weeks for his involvement in the event. However, both pilots had successful careers after this, and the skies they flew in were more safer due to the reforms brought about by this tragedy. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. Stay safe, and see you in the next one.